Hello everybody, Maven here, and today we're investigating a build that is apparently almost too strong in Bungie's opinion, and that's the good old Mothkeeper Ex Diris build. Technically not the Mothkeepers, but it's kind of implied, so we're going to throw it in there anyways. But the main culprit here is the Ex Diris, because Bungie issued a statement in a recent twid that said this. At the start of Revenant, we issued a patch note stating that Ex Diris would be receiving a 33% increase to direct impact damage, on top of spawning more mods on hits and getting increased ammo reserves. This note was left over from internal playtesting. While we originally planned to increase its damage, we found that the weapon was overperforming across numerous activities. Interesting. We continue to monitor the performance of the weapon in a live environment and are happy with its current place in our overall weapon sandbox. So, in their eyes, the Ex Diris is kinda sus, a little too good for comfort. So today, I'll be the judge of that. So we got some testing to do and a build to break down. Who knows, maybe it'll be better than I think it is because I've never really given it a fair shot after its buff. So let's break it down. Hope you enjoy. This video is sponsored by Advanced GG, the only clinically proven gaming supplement shown to improve your gaming performance. Use code Maven at checkout for 10% off your order. Link down below. Thank you. So first things first, if you haven't seen the full patch notes for the Ex Diris, here they are. As mentioned before, impact damage was increased by 33% and the reserves were increased by 5. They also made some changes to its velocity, but most importantly, they messed with the moth generation, which was always my biggest gripe with this thing. I gotta say though, it's still not where I want it to be. They changed it from a 4 to 3 second cooldown, but I honestly wish it had no cooldown. I want to see a horde of moths. Go ahead, nerf its damage a bit, but I want to create an army of moths because that'd be epic. But at least they gave it a new function that it will create a moth on 2 direct hits, which is a great addition to the weapon because it previously required a kill to create a moth. So previously, this weapon kind of punished you if you went up against a tankier target because you ain't gonna spawn moths against them with this weapon when it requires a kill. But now it's not an issue because 2 hits on them will make a moth and help out with your DPS. So this change really buffed one of its pain points. So let's cut to the chase and get to the nitty gritty. How much damage does the Ex Diris do? That's what we're all here for. Well, I did some damage comparisons at Carl and Furzia, but comparisons against what? Well, I had to think, what is another special weapon competing in the same slot that plays the same role, doubling as ad clear and DPS? Of course, the Choir of One. This is easily one of the top weapons in the entire game, and I felt it was a perfect thing to go head to head against the Ex Diris. So let's start out against Furzia. The only buff we're using is Well of Radiance, and I got a buddy here literally just to distract the boss because she basically insta-kills you with her eye blast, even in a well. Now, as you know, the Ex Diris speeds up in rate of fire the more you land hits with it, but it speeds up at an even faster rate when amplified. But that doesn't really matter here, since we're dumping all 39 of our base reserves anyway, which I will say is a ton of reserves, and that's nice. And we end up with 1.6 million damage, but if you had on a reserve mod, the max it goes to is 40 ammo, so it only increases it by 1. So it's really not worth it. So you can just add in an extra 36k to our total if you wanted to calculate that 1 extra shot. But now let's move on to the Choir of One, and this is going to be with the base reserves of 200, which really isn't much. You typically want to use reserves of the Choir of One, so that's just 8 clips of ammo. This weapon is really only meant for burst damage with various envious arsenal combos. It's not really meant for DPS on its own. So we ran out of ammo rather quickly and our total ends up at 1.3 million, so it's kind of lacking a bit compared to Ex Diris, but let's see that again, but this time with reserve mods. Unlike the Ex Diris, the Choir of One actually benefits from them, bringing us from 200 ammo to 300 ammo. I'd say that's a pretty big difference compared to Ex Diris' 39 to 40 ammo, and in this damage phase we're able to get off a couple more mags, but the phase did end with us having 50 ammo remaining, so not ideal, but we'll take it. And it ended up matching the Ex Diris at 1.6 million, but just slightly more. However, with the Choir of One, the damage phase actually ended. But with the Ex Diris, we dumped all of our ammo before the phase ended and still had enough time to go jump off a cliff before it ended. And that's not even taking into account that you can possibly get out the gates quicker if you were amplified, which we were not. So Ex Diris is the clear winner in terms of sustained DPS, but what about burst DPS? Well, that brings us to our Carl comparison. And I was not ready for what I was about to see, so I thought the Choir of One would be the clear winner, but to my absolute surprise, it was a draw. Like an exact draw, down to the frame. I paired these clips up by the frame the first shot hit and ended on the shot that killed, and it was literally down to the same frame. Now, unfortunately, the Ex Diris doesn't proc the concussive reload artifact mod, at least against Carl it doesn't, but I think I've noticed it working against other targets. But what I do know is that it does synergize with arc compounding, which says your arc sources deal an extra 15% damage against blind targets. moths. And when your moths hit targets, it does blind them. So that just further boosts the Ex Diris beyond the Choir of One, at least for a few more months. Now that concludes damage testing. Now moving on to the next test, and for this one I had to grab a snippet from a video I did last month testing all the exotic changes from Revenant, which is why it's muted. And here I tested the velocity changes, which is probably the biggest pain point of the Ex Diris. This thing is very difficult to hit your target with because the velocity is atrocious. Now they did improve it a bit, but it's so minuscule that you don't really even notice it. And in my experience, in order to use this thing effectively, you either gotta have the high ground or you gotta be in the air. Ain't no way you're hitting anything uphill. There's just no way. I really hope Bungie one day just says F it and turns this thing's velocity into a micro missile frame. And while they're at it, reduce its self damage to that of a micro missile frame as well. To be honest, I don't think you should do any self damage because it's far easier to use this weapon when you can barrel stuff with it. But as you can see here, if you do that, you die in a couple shots because the self damage is massive, mate. And if you use the Blast Wave Striders on Titan to reduce your self damage with explosive weapons, it doesn't even really help. If you try to barrel stuff with the weapon, you're still gonna die in just a few shots. It just sucks that the easiest way to actually land your shots with this weapon isn't really viable. So for the trade-off of doing better damage than the Choir of One, it's just straight up more difficult to use. So in the gameplay, you'll see me constantly hopping so I can rain down from above with it. And another huge downside of this weapon is that in order for it to do good damage, you really got to make direct impact because the splash damage is laughable. And that's another thing that Bungie should buff on this thing. But anyways, let's finally talk about the Mothkeeper wraps because this is what some of you might be here for. So it's no secret that these two exotics are two peas in a pod. They were literally built to be paired with each other. So what the Mothkeeper wraps does is give you an extra grenade charge and your grenades become moth nades, which split into two moths. One moth will be Arc, which will seek an enemy and blow up and blind them. And the other moth will be Void, which will seek an ally and grant half an overshield. And the damage is actually pretty decent on these. Now, something to note is that if no enemies are nearby, that it will generate two Void Moths and just grant you a full overshield and vice versa. If you were nowhere near where you threw your nade, it'll sometimes make two Arc Moths if enemies are nearby, so it really depends. Cons are that the nades are pretty slow, but pros are obviously the free second charge, and the fact that it blinds, so it can stun unstoppable champions, which you might have seen or will see in the background gameplay. Now, the reason that this exotic is so good with the Ex Diris is because the moth that the Ex Diris makes will now become two moths just like the Mothkeeper nades, so as you're ad clearing, you're just getting free overshields out of nowhere, which is really nice for survivability. Now, as you can see in the background gameplay, we're on Void. How did I end up on Void? Well, let's take it from the top. Some of you might be aware that if you use the Widow Silk aspect on Strand, it stacks on top of the fact that the Mothkeeper will grant you an extra nade charge, so you will have 3 moth nades. And you have the Thread of Generation Fragment to help you charge your nades quicker, so it's not a bad option, but it leaves a bit to be desired, because without grapple punches, that means you don't have Unravel, therefore Generation is tougher to use efficiently. Next up, there's Prismatic, because it has a stylish Executioner aspect, which says that defeating targets affected by an elemental debuff will make you invis. And the moths do blind, and if you run Dominance, they jolt. As you can see here, Moth Final Blows will make you invis, both from your nades and from your Ex Diris. Seems kinda crazy having the ability to go invis on literally every kill, but Void does have a stylish Executioner aspect as well, except it will not proc with the blind moths because it requires a Void debuff target. Now there is the Echo of Undermining Fragment, which says that your nades will cause weaken, and that's a Void debuff, but sadly it does not affect the Arc Moth, so it will not make us invisible. So you might be wondering, why the heck are we on Void and not Prismatic? Well, because I felt that one of the biggest strengths of the Mothkeeper build was to obviously spam moth nades, and on Prismatic there wasn't really much that allowed us to do that. I tried plenty of things, such as dodging and combination blowing with impact induction, but then at that point, I never really utilized the Ex Diris. I was just punching. So I found out that the best way to utilize our kit and spam as many moth nades as possible was to go on Void with Echo of Starvation to give us Devour whenever we pick up a Void Breach or an Orb of Power. And Devour is obviously great for survivability because Final Blows will heal us, but most importantly, Final Blows while Devour is active will grant us grenade energy. And this was massive. This helps a ton when it came to nade spam, more than Prismatic could ever hope for. And I felt that this was the best way to take advantage of both of our exotics. So with that said, let's break down the rest of the build. Besides Starvation, we got Persistence to keep our Invis and Devour longer. Then we got Exchange, which was meant to be paired along with Trapper's Ambush, the Smoke Bomb Slam ability. It says that melee Final Blows return some grenade energy, and yes, the Smoke Bomb Slam works. And this is also meant to be used along with Echo of Harvest, which says defeating a weakened target creates an Orb of Power and a Void Breach. And with that in mind, that brings us to our mods, because on our gloves, we got heavy-handed to make an orb on melee Final Blows. So all in one motion, we're going to make 2 orbs and a void breach, and when we grab said orb, we're proccing absolution, innervation, and insulation on our boots to get a boatload of ability energy refunded. And at the same time, that's proccing focusing strike and impact induction on our gloves to get back some nade and dodge energy. So TLDR, our smoke bomb slams are extremely good for our ability spam and also armor charge. And we want this armor charge because we're rocking special finisher on the class item for our Ex Diris to never run out of ammo. Now, to address the elephant in the room, no grenade-based mods do not work with moths, which honestly really sucks because they should. Bungie should really consider updating this so moths can proc things like firepower, momentum transfer, and bolstering detonation. But anyways, moving on to the rest of our mods. Starting from the top, we got Arc Siphon and Double Special Finder for once again to help with the Ex Diris. On our chest, we can run triple resist if we want, but I did sneak in 1 Arc Reserves, despite the fact that it only grants the Ex Diris 1 extra ammo, because it can help our heavy weapon as well depending on what you run, so it's interchangeable. And finally, on our class item, besides Special Finisher, the other 2 mods are a bit loose and I've messed around with them. I wanted Bomber for more moth spam, but at the same time, Reaper is such a great mod to have, but I just couldn't argue with the helpfulness of Powerful Attraction, so I swapped to that at the last second. But if you replace Bomber with Reaper, I wouldn't argue with you. For our stat distribution, I recommend prioritizing double 100s in resilience and discipline while maintaining that tier 3 intellect soft cap and dumping the rest into mobility. For our loadout, I'd recommend something like this. The reason I have a scout in the kinetic slot is because the moths deal with unstops, the Ex Diris deals with overloads, so all we need to cover is barriers with our scout. And ignore my Wendigo, it's just a placeholder. I'd highly recommend a Guttural Bittersweet if you have one, because it is arc and takes advantage of our arc reserves on the chest, and that about does it for the build. So now to address Bungie's concern, is this build almost too good? Is it borderline? Well, I will admit that the Ex Diris is slapping really hard for a special, but I think the trade-off of it being extremely hard to use balances it out. So in my opinion, no, it's not broken, but I will say that it did exceed my expectations. This is my first time ever utilizing it in a build on this channel, and I was actually pretty impressed with it for the most part. I definitely overlooked this thing since Revenant. Now, is this the best Mothkeeper Ex Diris build? I'd say yes, but is this the best Mothkeeper build and is this the best Ex Diris build? I'd say no. There's better ways to utilize the Ex Diris. Like I said, it helps a lot to be airborne, so I'd rather use it on something like Solar Warlock with Heat Rises, and there's also better ways to utilize the Mothkeeper's wraps. As a matter of fact, I did a video on this before, and I'll link it down below, and I'll also link it in the top right corner of this video if you'd like to check it out. And if you enjoy the Mothkeeper's wraps, then it's very much worth your while to go and check that video out, because there's a lot of good information about the Mothkeepers in there. And also in that video, I break down the best way to abuse the Mothkeeper's wraps, which is not with the Ex Diris, it's with something much better. So the whole point of this video is just to explore what Bungie thought might have been too good. And if I worked at Bungie, I wouldn't nerf the Ex Diris. As a matter of fact, I would buff it. Like I said before, what I would do is give it the velocity and self-damage of a micro missile frame. And I know that wouldn't make much sense flavorfully since it's supposed to be a hive boomer, but I think I would make an exception. But to keep the flavor, if not the micro missile velocity, then I would just remove the self-damage because it's so hard to use this thing when you're not at point blank. But anyways, a dim loadout link to this build will be down below in the description and also the pinned comment if you'd like to give it a try. And if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate if you hit the like button and let me know in the comments what you think about the build. And if you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Would love to have you here for more content on the way. And remember to check out our sponsor, Advanced GG, code Maven at checkout for 10% off, link down below. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. See you later.